Good evening, everyone. My name is Meredith Walters. It's a pleasure to welcome you here for this conversation with some of the nonfiction award winners from the Whiting Foundation. I am the Director of Arts and Culture at Brooklyn Public Library, and we're always grateful when we get to partner with the Whiting Foundation to celebrate their nonfiction writers, and especially in this discussion, which will focus on stories of resilience. From the aftermath of the Rwandan killing fields to internal battles with chronic illness, from Nina Simone's galvanizing anthem to the untold stories of a Filipino immigrant family, these authors, Philip Gurevich, Megan O'Rourke, Salamisha Tillett, and Albert Sameha, manifest courageous storytelling. After brief readings, they'll be in conversation with our friend and tonight's moderator, Ken Chen. And before I introduce you to Ken, I want to invite you to visit our website, the BPL Presents website. That's at bklynlibrary.org/BPL Presents. And there you can see all of our upcoming conversations, author talks. We have a fantastic Lenape exhibition that we invite you to come see at our Greenpoint Library. Concerts, please join us. They're all for free, as everything we do at the library is free. So visit us there and come visit us very soon live. Now I'd like to turn things over to Ken Chen. He is an assistant professor and the associate director of creative writing at Barnard College. And he's currently at work on a new book, Death Star, about colonialism and the underworld. His poetry collection, Juvenilia, was selected by Louise Glick for the 2009 Yale Series of Younger Poets. Please welcome Ken and all of our authors. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, can you all see me?
You're great, we see you.
Okay, sorry. That was a dramatic pause inserted for emphasis. I wanted to thank Meredith and everyone at the Brooklyn Public Library, including Joel, and also Michael Takins for helping organize this event. And of course, from the Whiting Foundation, Courtney Hodel and Daniel Reed. And if you were all together and we were in person and sweating and coughing on each other, we'd have a lot more audience interaction. But I don't know if you can do like, emojis and things like this, but how many of you in the audience are yourselves writers? Or is it possible for you to respond? Seems like we got a few. We have a thumbs up, a sympathy thumbs up from Meredith. So in case you are a nonfiction writer yourself, the Whiting Foundation has this creative nonfiction grant, which all of our marvelous guests have received in the past. So you might want to take a look at their website, whiting.org. The deadline for the next round is actually April 25th. So it's a grant that, unlike a lot of grants, reward work that you've already accomplished, a book that you've already done. If you go to whiting.org, you'll see that this grant rewards a book that might not have even been written yet, a book that you're still finishing. So if you are writing a memoir, a history, a biography, creative nonfiction, check it out at whiting.org. I'm really excited for the four authors that we have tonight. These are all stories about resilience, and they also occurred to me that there's stories about how do we revise a popular and maybe conservative narrative? How do we come out the other end with a narrative for the future, or a narrative that takes into account everything from the past, but creates a new horizon where we can all belong? So we're going to do short readings, and then we'll do a Q&A. So think about your questions for our Oprah book talk segment later on the program. First, we have Albert Samaha, whose book Conception: An Immigrant Family's Fortune is a really beautiful weaving together of his personal history and kind of the history of immigration within a colonial context. As he writes in the beginning, America is an unreliable narrator. And then so how do you as a writer try to correct the unreliable narration that we've received through the form of American nationalism or folk stories about founding fathers? This book tells many stories, from the history of Spanish colonialism in Asia to the history of Filipinos in America, to a kind of very fast history of actually Philippine national politics. At its best, it's also a tremendous love letter to his Filipino family, and specifically places that you might not have ever been to before, like Vallejo, California, where you can get lumpia and ube ice cream at the Safeways near the freeway exit, and a place that has the unlikely distinction of being immortalized by E40 and a bunch of other non-East Bay, non-LA, non-New York rappers. Albert is the inequality editor at BuzzFeed News, and he has another book as well, Never Ran, Never Will, Boyhood and Football in a Changing American City, which won the New York Society's Libraries 2019 award. Let's give him all a hand and welcome him to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken. Shout out to the 707 indeed. I'll just do a quick reading here to start. My mom and I learned parallel stories of America. Her earliest understanding filtered through histories written by white people in positions of authority, broadcast across the ocean in textbook tales of a democracy founded upon Christian values, the reassuring rhetoric of presidential speeches and John Wayne movies, newscasts on internal conflicts that nudged America to a better place, snippets of Martin Luther King Jr.'s words about seeing the mountaintop and the moral arc of the universe bending toward justice. The understanding hardened with time, packed together by her migrant ambition to learn the rules and climb the ranks. It only occurred to me years later that while my mom was raising me to blend in among white people, I was a kid who wanted to be Black. I didn't think of it that way at the time. I was simply picking up cues from the influences in front of me. The contours of American reality unfurled for me in songs, shows, and sports books. Culture seeped faster into my childhood brain than classroom knowledge. The stories I heard were set amid unjust odds, neglectful institutions, and repressive forces. I learned about Huey Newton from a Tupac song, 2 shots in the dark, now Huey's dead, before I ever heard his name mentioned in school. I read in the paperback on my nightstand that Josh Gibson might have been better than Babe Ruth, and I watched from the DVD spinning in our living room, the crew-cutted cop kill Radio Raheem. Like many second-generation immigrants, I learned about our country from Black people. I didn't yet know about Parchman Farm Prison or Black Wall Street or the Tuskegee syphilis experiment or the massacres of the post-Reconstruction era or the CIA supplying the crack cocaine trade. But I was learning the language necessary to understand the magnitude of that history. From those stories in childhood, warning marks etched on the road by travelers long before us, I picked up on the fact that my family and our fellow immigrants weren't new arrivals merely to a nation, but to a long-standing system of racial oppression, suspended somewhere between those who conquered the land by blood and those whose blood built the empire. We had come by choice, but in peace, with neither the privileges of whiteness nor the weight of Blackness. Where did that leave us? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Albert. Next, we have Megan O'Rourke, the author of The Invisible Kingdom and Reimagining Chronic Illness. And I'm sure in the last few years, there's been something that we've thought about more than anything else, which is what does it mean to live in the age of illness? And a lot of us probably know people who've passed because of COVID or people who are very vulnerable because they have weakened immune systems. You may have reflected on people who've gotten it and who have gotten long COVID, or thought about your own experiences when you've gone to the doctor and told the doctor exactly how you were feeling and were immediately ignored or not heard. I think if any of this relates to you, you should definitely immediately go out and buy The Invisible Kingdom as a book that's very lyrical and intellectual and heavily reported and rich in context and introspection and reporting, but also just tremendously useful in our world where we're kind of all living with a constant specter of disease. It's a book of feminism, a book of what it means to be in your body and not be believed when you speak of it. It's also a book of epistemology. How do I know what is happening to my body? How do I get someone else to know something that can only exist through my physical sensations of having a body? And a book about ontology, like, am I the I who is the one who has a body? If my body is attacking itself or worrying itself, is that me that's fighting me? There are a lot of very literary and philosophical discourses within this book but it's also a book I think that's very useful and timely for our moment. Megan, of course, is the author also of The Long Goodbye and the poetry collections Sun and Days, Once, and Half Life, as well as a Guggenheim Fellow and editor at the Yale Review. Let's give Megan a hand.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just want to say a huge thanks, of course, to Ken and everyone who made this event happen, but to the Whiting Foundation, because this book was 8.5 years in the making, and it would not be made today without the Whiting Foundation. I'm going to read just a few pages, a little bit from the introduction and another section. The stories we tell about illness usually have startling beginnings. Sorry. The fall at the supermarket, the lump discovered in the abdomen during a routine exam, the doctor's call. Not mine. I got sick the way Hemingway says you go broke, gradually and then suddenly. One way to tell my story would be to say that I got ill just after college in the late 1990s, when I began experiencing daily hives, dizziness, chronic pain, and drenching night sweats, long before any doctor believed I was sick. Another way to tell my story would be to say the illness took hold in the days after my mother died on Christmas of 2008. When I caught a virus, a debilitating fatigue overcame me. My lymph nodes ached for months, and I slid into an exhausted fog I attributed to grief. A month later, a doctor found that I had Epstein-Barr virus. Still another way would be to say that my illness became unignorable roughly 3 years after my mother's death, starting in January 2012 on a windy beach by a derelict hotel in Vietnam. Jim, my partner, and I were reading by the water when I noticed a strange rash on my inner arm. 7 or 8 raised red bumps arranged in a circle. It looks like Braille, I thought. But what was it trying to tell me? The beach was a mess that day, scattered with the skeletal alien branches of palm trees. I was in the grips of the discomforting loneliness that can come when wild weather presses around you. Look at this, I said to Jim, who glanced at the angry, inflamed rash and said, that's strange. It was strange, stranger than I imagined at the time. I had no idea then that I was living at the edge of medical knowledge. I had been intermittently unwell since I graduated from college in 1997, and now was getting steadily worse, like a person who can't swim, moving step by step into deep water. But no one knew why. At first, no one even believed I was ill. Not even I did, exactly. One of the hardest things about being ill with a poorly understood disease is that most people find what you're going through incomprehensible, if they even believe you are going through it. In your loneliness, your preoccupation with an enduring new reality, you want to be understood in a way that you can't be. Pain is always new to the sufferer, but loses its originality for those around him. Alphonse Daudet observes in The Land of Pain. Everyone will get used to it except me. Worrying that your symptoms are psychosomatic or even imagined is part of life for many people with poorly understood illnesses. Although the experience of illness is not just in the head, it is also not just in the body. The person enduring such an illness faces a difficult balancing act. On the one hand, she must advocate for herself, even when doctors are indifferent or ignorant, and not be deterred when she knows something is wrong. On the other, she must also be willing to ask whether an obsessive attention to symptoms is going to lead to better health. The patient has to hold in mind 2 contradictory modes, in other words, insistence on the reality of the disease and resistance to her own catastrophic fears. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Next with Philip Gorevich, and many of you may have read his book, We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families, Stories from Rwanda, which kind of became instantly one of the great classics of a certain type of witness literature or international reporting. And if you too are someone who is interested in the rest of the world or whose politics have solidarities that extend more transnationally, this book might have been very important for you as a way of imagining what it meant to think about moral problems or the suffering of others when it happens not just within our borders. For the Whiting Grant, Philip is working on a new book, which is sort of a sequel, if that doesn't sound too gauche, to the first book, titled "You Hide That You Hate Me, and I Hide That I Know," which, is that correct?
Right.
Which is sort of about actually a much more challenging story, not just that genocide has happened and that trauma is real, but then how do you come back? What is the future of reconciliation? Is reconciliation, forgiveness, total BS, or is it something that you can actually forge in ways that might be sometimes difficult and other times mundane and surprising? We had a really lovely conversation about the book in progress, and it sounded like a incredibly profound journey of reconnecting with some of the characters and seeing how they have had to deal with these aspects of forgiveness and very severe pain and trauma, not just in the immediate moment, but over the kind of like long durée of their own lives. Philip, of course, is also a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker and former editor at the Paris Review, as well as the author of Standard Operating Procedure about Abu Ghraib and A Cold Case. I'm very excited to hear him talk about his next book. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And thank you to the Whiting Foundation for supporting me in progress, which has been a long progress. It's one of the things about writing about a place that's genuinely far away and foreign, and where all the references are not necessarily available to the people I'm probably talking to tonight, though some of them may well know, is that it's hard to find a short excerpt that has that is its own context to some extent. And mostly I've been going back to this one hill and to a few survivors of the genocide and the main killer of their families, who lives, they live side by side, their families live side by side to this day. And in Rwanda, they had a kind of process of trials and confessions and prison terms and so forth. He had gotten out of prison, but I had tracked down the transcript of his very long confession, and it was handwritten in a kind of graph paper ledger. And I'd photographed it at the office where I was shown it, and taken it and found a kid to translate it. I was referred to this guy whom I'd never met before. And he delayed and delayed and delayed. His name was Calixte. He seemed very eager when I met him, and he seemed really like he'd have it done the next day, but he kept putting it off. And I finally thought maybe he really doesn't like this material. And when he came to me, he brought it and he said, you know what this is? This is just killers killing and talking about killing. And then he's ended up talking to me for like 4 hours about his own story. And his own family had been killed when he was a small child. And then in the years after the genocide, the people who had killed his family returned and picked off survivors. It's a pattern that was called killing the evidence in 3 different times. And when he was 18, he and his 2 younger brothers were the only ones left. After Calixte and his younger brothers buried their mother, they abandoned their hill. The family homestead became empty grass, he said, and the boys became 3 more orphan street kids in Kigali. Our houses are still there, our land is there, but I can't go there, Calixte said. And I can't allow my brothers to go there, really. How can I trust people who killed us 3 times? The same people. I can't. The thought of reconciliation offended him. 3 times in 5 years, he said again. More than a decade after he and his brothers buried his mother, Calixte said it was still too soon for him to trust even the kindliest, most upright of their childhood neighbors, the people, as he put it, who did nothing against us, and when there were killings, used to come and help us bury bodies. He said, they act like they love us, but I can't tell. As for the killers, Calixte said, the first question for most young survivors was not whether to live with them, but whether to kill them. The temptation had preoccupied him a good deal in his teens and early 20s. Imagine the case of somebody whose family is dead, and he's still with his brothers and sisters who have got trauma, he said. Except for the sisters, this hypothetical case was identical with his own. Every night you don't sleep, just trying to calm down your brothers. And most of the time, they not only have trauma, but also they are hungry. They have not eaten. And mostly they are out of school because there are no beans to eat or sell. And yet the cause is there. And his kids are at school and they eat every time and they have no trauma. His wife is still there and they can make children again. Sometimes, you understand, it is hard to manage it. The cause. That word was the fulcrum of Calic's meditations on the temptation of killing his family's killer. The temptation was not, as it might seem, simply to avenge the death, but to avenge the conditions of his life. There was nothing he could do for his murdered parents, but he could at least know the justice of removing the cause of his and his brother's affliction. I could have done it, Calic said, if I wanted. That was important to him, to believe that revenge was his choice. He didn't want me to think he had simply subjugated himself to the law. No, he'd thought it through. Sitting awake on dank, hungry nights in the city, watching over his brother's sleep in some market shed or vacant lot or crowded flophouse, Calic's had played his revenge scenarios over and over in his mind, studying them like films or texts to figure out what exactly the satisfaction was that he imagined in them. He couldn't relate to the stock phrases about getting even or taking justice into your own hands. Killing couldn't make up for killing. Nothing could right the wrong of the genocide. There was no settling that score. So revenge was not punishment. Revenge was its own end. Punishment was something you did to the other guy, and revenge was something you did for yourself. You gave punishment. You took revenge. You didn't take revenge because you believed in justice. You took revenge because you believed that justice was impossible. By this reasoning, Calic's decided that it would make sense for him to kill his family's killers. But he didn't think it would be right. He didn't think he should be allowed to get away with it. If you decided that a killer should not live, and that it was your burden to see to that, Calic's concluded, then you had to hold yourself to account too. You don't even forgive yourself, he said. It's a death, and a death is a death. You say, my parents are dead, they'll never come back, it's nothing to join them. So you can go kill, then kill yourself. It was an extraordinary argument. Suicide as the logical and ethical conclusion of revenge killing, an act not only of despair, but also of principle. You took responsibility by taking your own life. In doing so, you also removed yourself as a target for an ongoing spiral of reprisal and return. Calic's laid out the scenario so starkly and convincingly that I had to remind myself that he wasn't making the case for it. On the contrary, he was explaining that he had chosen to forgo revenge, not for the sake of justice or in the name of forgiveness, but to save his own life.
Thank you, Philip. That was so moving. A lot of you may know that today is a kind of mystical date, 2/22/22. But yesterday was also a very important day in that it was the birthday of the great Nina Simone, who was born yesterday in 1933. Salamisha Tillett is reading another work in progress for her book, All the Rage, Mississippi Goddamn in the World Nina Simone Made. And it is not a straightforward biography or even a form of cultural criticism. Rather, it's a way of reimagining Nina Simone as a Black Cassandra, a prophet whose rage went unheard. It is not quite a history book, not a biography, not music criticism, but a kind of seance, bringing Nina Simone back as a usable past, an ancestor who is still relevant in a post-Black Lives Matter age. Also, interestingly enough, Nina Simone as a kind of geography, a place where Salamisha herself can go, take her kids, visit after a protest, and explore this near history of a great kind of prophetic artist. Salamisha is a professor at Rutgers University in Newark, the Henry Rutgers professor, as well as the director of Express Newark, which deals with social justice and art, critic at large for the New York Times, and the author of In Search of the Color Purple about Alice Walker and the great Sites of Slavery, Citizenship and Racial Democracy in the Post-Civil Rights Imagination. as well as the co-founder of the great nonprofit A Long Walk Home in Chicago. So please let's give a hand for Salamisha.
Thank you. That was such a nice a description of the book, and I kind of need it because it's I'm wrapping it up and I need all the inspiration I can have these days. So I guess we'll probably talk about that in the Q&A. But I will begin in the early part of the book. I came to Nina Simone through the back door. I would like to tell you that I grew up on her music and that I've always been a radical feminist, but that's not the truth. I grew up on disco, funk, and a smattering of soul. On any given morning in the late 1970s, I'd wake up to my mother playing Roberta Flack, Chaka Khan, and even Phyllis Hyman. A jazz singer in her own right, my mother was born in 1955 at the dawn of the civil rights movement. Like so many in my hip hop generation, I discovered Nina through snippets, first through synthesized loops and rap samples, and later in YouTube clips and movie soundtracks. When I did find her, or better put, when she found me, I knew her only as a name drop. I was at the height of my own depression after having been violently raped in Kenya by a near stranger 10 months earlier. And if Lauryn Hill hadn't made herself heir apparent to Nina by rhyming in the Fuji song Ready or Not, so while you're imitating Al Capone, I'll be Nina Simone and defecating on your microphone, I would not have known that Nina Simone existed. It was during my long season of suffering, racked by suicidal thoughts and fantasies of revenge, that I became obsessed with Nina Simone's gun. Not the air gun that she fired at 2 white teenage boys outside her home in the south of France in 1995. Nina told the judge that those boys wouldn't quit their bullshit. Yeah, I'm coming to your party, they heckled in faux black speech. So she hit one of them with buckshot in the leg. Her aim had improved since an incident in a Swiss restaurant a few years earlier. Where's my money, she demanded at the time, firing a gun at a record executive who released her albums without paying her. Right before a bullet skimmed his face, the man retorted, "We're not going to give you any." Her sole regret, she later said, "Sorry, I didn't get him." Those guns were real, as was yet another that she brought to the opening of a penthouse club named after her in Morocco, ready to pull the trigger on anyone who dared cheat her. The gun I became obsessed with was the one she didn't make, the one she turned into a song. This is a show tune, but the show hasn't been written for it yet. So said Simone before she debuted Mississippi Goddam at Carnegie Hall on March 22nd, 1964. Soon, though, they realized that her show tune was not a bit or a gag. It was instead a Molotov cocktail backed by a mid-tempo beat. The name of this tune is Mississippi Goddam, she warned the crowd, and I mean every word of it. Simone took the song's title from the state in which Medgar Evers, the Mississippi NAACP field secretary, was shot dead in his driveway by a white supremacist on June 12, 1963. She was also marking the moment of her own political awakening, one that began in the wake of his murder and culminated with the bombing of the 4 little girls in Birmingham, Alabama. At the time of Evers' killing, she simply took it in as just one of the many bitter news stories that had come to define their time. I was still turning the other cheek, she said, but his murder and the ease with which Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett was able to approach and shake hands with Evers' killer at his trial opened up something new inside of her. Without realizing it, Simone had begun the process of political conversion, not just hers, but one that anticipated the steps necessary for racial consciousness to be raised in almost every corner of America today. Reflecting on the significance of Evers' death, Simone said, "What I didn't appreciate was that while Medgar Evers' murder was not the final straw for me, it was the match that lit the fuse." When I woke up to the grand jury decision not to indict Darren Wilson, the police officer who shot Michael Brown to death on a St. Louis street, the hashtag Ferguson Goddam had already gone viral. That morning in 2014, I gave my students the option to leave my class and to join the protest swelling on the other side of campus. On our way, undergraduates dressed in black fatigues, red handprints painted on their faces chanted, "Hands up, don't shoot." A few minutes later, I glanced at my phone and saw a headline in The Guardian. It ran, "Ferguson Goddam. No indictment for Darren Wilson is no surprise." This is why we protest. On June 1st, 2020, a week after Officer Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd in Minneapolis, Alexander Simone, Nina Simone's grandson, joined thousands of protesters in the beach town of Asbury Park, New Jersey. Alexander, the son of Simone's only child, Lisa Strode Kelly, stood on stage, megaphone in hand, and chanted, "For George Floyd, fight the fight." Alexander wore a t-shirt bearing an iconic image of his grandmother, the singer facing straight ahead, wearing tiny hooped earrings and a beaded choker, her afro perfectly speared. The crowd, mostly young and white, chanted back Simone's words. 30 seconds later, their voices, now a collective, let out a roaring crescendo. Black Lives Matter. About an hour away, I too left my house. After months of self-quarantine, I joined the thousands of protesters who gathered in front of the county courthouse in downtown Newark. I was unaware of it at the time, but our dissent was echoed by millions of people all over the United States, making Black Lives Matter the largest racial justice movement ever in our country's history. Rather than respond to the critiques of the police violence against Black communities with resistance or indifference, white people made up the majority of the protests in most counties and cities across the country. This transformation was remarkable, not only because most white Americans were decidedly against Black Lives Matter when the movement started in 2013, but even more incredible, Black rage, the primary political emotion that fueled Black Lives Matter, was now the mainstream antidote to white supremacy. Such acceptance was unprecedented. After Nina Simone performed at Carnegie Hall, her record company Philips censored the song's title by marketing it as Mississippi blank on the album cover, an executive decision that did little to deter white record buyers from Arkansas and Mississippi who returned the album, smashed in half, to Philips' main office. Goddamn might not feel as powerful as an expletive as NWA's 1988 protest song, F the Police, but the invocation of God on one hand and damn on the other was a risky musical venture in 1964. As a daughter of a Methodist preacher mother, Simone was breaking ranks with both the civil rights movement and the more respectable turn the other cheek politics of her youth. Here, she was cursing God and unabashedly calling out white America for its refusal to end racial violence against Black citizens. Noting the high level of scrutiny that plagued Simone as a result of the song's title, Sepia, an African-American high society magazine, wrote in its 1967 profile on Simone, "Male entertainers of the caliber of Frank Sinatra and Oscar Brown Jr. can sprinkle their song offerings with four-letter words such as hell and damn, and sermonize without fear of incurring the wrath of the critics. Nina Simone enjoys no such freedom." Thank you.
What can you do? Thank you so much, Salamisha. So I guess I'd like to invite Philip, Albert, and Megan to all come back and unmute and turn on your videos and everything. I want to give you all a hand. I wish you could hear everyone clapping. And I guess I was trying to think about ways where all four of your books sort of relate or have things in common. And I at first thought maybe there was an element of like an element of reckoning with the past. And then I slowly realized that, or reckoning with being unheard. And I slowly realized that maybe a different way to frame that was that one thing that struck me with all four of your books was that in a way they're kind of about belonging. Like, what does it mean to be a social citizen? What does it mean to try to rectify the thing that happened in the past? What if belonging is impossible? So like Albert, a lot of your book is sort of about your family or your childhood and what does it mean to have a kind of in-between social citizenship, in America, and Megan, I feel like your whole book is sort of, it is about science, but it's also sort of about the psychodynamics of illness and what does it mean when no one will listen to you? What does it mean when no one will hear you? Or what are the kind of ethical implications of being in pain where someone else, you talk to a philosopher friend of yours who's like, I'm tired of your pain because it puts an ethical like implication on me, In Salamisha, like you could have written a very different book that was sort of about Nina as a main character. But I feel like a lot of it is about how do we remember her? Like how do we see her through the prism of someone building a monument to her that you see, or someone who like her town, which has a like weird relationship with her and is not accepting, you know, and it's not easy to remember, you know. And Philip, you were kind of talking about how at a certain point you have to decide to not have revenge, and that decision might be about, there might be like a kumbaya version where it's like we belong, we have truth and reconciliation, but there are these other shades of it that are more complicated, that are like, well, I don't want to kill you just because I don't want to commit suicide, you know. So what, I don't know if this is like an abstract question, but I thought as a way to like bring it all together, like what does it mean for the characters in your book to belong, or what would it mean to you know, for Nina Simone to be properly honored, or for, you know, you in the doctor's office, Megan, to be heard, or, you know, like in Philip and Albert, your books about kind of not having social citizenship or not being accepted, like what are the stakes of these questions? Does that kind of make sense? Feel free, anyone have a blast.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think when I think of belonging, I sort of think of, and it's both possibilities and restrictions. It's sort of this idea of shared collective experience. And I think so much of how we define our identities are often in relation or in contrast to those around us. I mean, I think the point you made at the start of your question about how we remember things is so critical to that question, because like in my book, for example, one of the challenges of tracing back Philippine history to the pre-colonial times is that the colonizers write the histories and erase those that came before it. So, you know, those in power are consistently shaping what it means to belong on the in-group and the out-group, right? So, you know, one of the tensions that I've really enjoyed exploring is, you know, the American mythology of welcoming all immigrants versus the reality of kind of this exclusion, right? That's this sort of tension being a long-running battle for America's soul. So I think to me, and for sort of the Filipino diasporas I address in my book, I think this sense of belonging is one that sort of, you come to America on the premise that it is the place where everyone belongs, only to realize that sort of the bounds of any empire create an in-group and an out-group, and coming here does not necessarily make you belong. That any place that has borders sort of creates tensions between what it means to be part of this group and what it means to not be part of this group.
Yeah, I can speak to that question too, Ken. It's funny, you know, as you're talking, I'm realizing that somehow I don't think I used the word belonging in my book, but you're right that so much of the book, which is about this particular kind of silent epidemic of chronic illness that are often considered invisible, hard to measure, hard to see, often not credited by doctors and by colleagues and friends. And one of the realizations I had that made me write the book was that when I first got sick, I thought of it as my problem, that sort of the problem I had to solve on my own, right? And in our kind of like late capitalist neoliberal culture of self-improvement, this was, you know, my autoimmune disease was my own doing somehow, and it reflected on me. And the more I began to read and speak to other patients and interact with the medical system and learn about the cause of a lot of these immune-mediated diseases, the more I came to see it's a social problem, right? It's a problem that is caused by our chemical regulation policies, that's caused by the lack of social support in this country, all kinds of things, right? Structural inequities that place stress on the body. And what really was astonishing to me was how much people who were sick, myself included, really craved recognition and validation from others. And how before I had that, I thought that was just the first step and then I needed other things. But actually, once I had the recognition and the validation, it became still challenging, but much easier to live with the physical realities that did not themselves change, because suddenly I belonged, right? And my condition, which is after all the human condition of getting sick and struggling in your body, was recognized. And it was that part of the illness experience where, in a culture that's very allergic to narratives that resist tidy recovery and narratives that resist tidy summation, yeah, the sort of sense of having been outcast by virtue of having a narrative that didn't fit the script, right, was probably the most challenging part for me and for many of the people I interviewed.
I guess I was thinking, when I originally wrote the book, the idea of form, which you talked about before, I wasn't sure if I would be doing a straightforward biography or I don't know. I mean, or a memoir. And so I think there's this collapsing of time that I'm really interested in with Nina Simone. And so this idea of belonging on one hand and her representing the ways in which African Americans continue to feel like they don't belong to the nation, as both a result of centuries long racism, but also there are these like flashpoints in which that comes to head. And obviously Nina's been there with the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, and now with Black Lives Matter. So there's this idea of like the unbelonging, and then there's also her being so beloved. And there's a way in which one, I think, marks a kind of relationship to the state, maybe, or a relationship to a kind of hometown, like what you see with Nina Simone that you were alluding to, is that now she's really accepted. But I've been there several times and over the course of the last decade, and that's an increasing acceptance of her. Nina Simone's the most famous person from Tryon, North Carolina, and yet it's only till literally 2020 where there's been a wide celebration of her. And so she always marked this kind of people, when the statue was constructed, I talk about how there were letters that were sent to the local newspaper, and her leaving of the United States in the 1970s was not just seen as a rejection of America, but was seen as a rejection of her hometown. And yet she's so beloved by so many different artists and activists. And so that to me, I guess, is like what I'm trying to explore in these chapters in this book through this temporal shifts between like her time and our time, and then her time, and then the near present, and then the current and the contemporary moment. And so I don't know, I just think it's like an interesting idea of like, who gets to belong, to what communities does she belong to, and who does she get rejected by? I guess the big question I was interested in is like her popularity has increased so much, right? And so optimistically, when I was writing some of this work, this was like 2020. Now we're like at a potential kind of backlash to the rise of Black Lives Matter. So, it's an interesting tone. It's more nostalgic in a way, even though at the time I was really like optimistic. So there's that too.
Well, there's a weird paradox to her popularity that you talked about, where you revisit all these places where she's like the most famous person from the town that like segregated her, and then the most famous person who got rejected from the classical school.
Yeah. It's true.
Yeah, I mean, the questions take different forms so much in each different circumstance. It's really interesting just to listen to everybody sort of apply it to what they're working on. When you say about sort of repairing or redeeming or the past, it's irreparable. And there's a lot of talk in and around Rwanda for or in skepticism about like the concepts of reconciliation. And I think one of the things that I came to sort of understand or see it as over time was that reconciliation makes no sense in terms of the past. It's always framed that way, but actually reconciliation only makes sense in terms of the future, right? It's only about the possibility of doing it differently or better, or just being able to live, right? Being able to live with each other later, but not being able to revise what took place. And in terms of this question of belonging, I think for those whose families were exterminated and who survived by what some might call luck and some might call misfortune, but by some, I mean, nobody survived once. Everybody survived multiple sort of close calls and flukes, and everybody who survived was helped by of Tutsis who survived were helped by Hutus, sometimes Hutus who also were killed, and sometimes by Hutus who were very brave and righteous only. So it's very complicated for them to feel a sense of belonging, and the belonging almost to humanity. I mean, that's taken a long time. What you do find that's an actual public issue, I think, is this idea of a certain kind of mixture of accountability and leniency for killers, right? That you take a country where an ordinary killer was certainly at the time of the genocide subject to the death penalty. Now the death penalty's gone. But in the tradition, that would be the logical, or that's just how it's dealt with. And instead, you're saying now that they've done this much more ultimate crime, they're maybe getting off after 12, 15 years for if they confess. But what does confession mean? Confession means kind of coming in from the cold. The people who don't confess and who remain in prison are the best argument for the confessors being given some sort of clemency, because you go and you meet them and it's like this total denial of reality. And that's a threat to everybody who lives in reality, right? They're still outside that human fold and staying loyal to the crime they committed. It's something beyond omerta, which is a kind of, code of fellow criminality. It's a kind of complete negation of what they, not just personal responsibility, but of the crime, of the reality of it, of the humanity still of the other people. And so if you actually say you're sorry, even if you're slightly going through the motions, and you acknowledge the wrongdoing, since you're talking about people who were not strangers to each other, right? This isn't like many of these situations where it's officials or you're sent off to a camp or people wear balaclavas and, come in the night. This is your neighbor in public who knew you all your life and who's maybe your neighbor still. That was really what it meant. Survivors often said to me, we can say hello to each other now, which seems like such a kind of almost incomprehensibly low bar for reckoning with genocide. And yet that's an amazing accomplishment to be able to, as they would say, like, if you're coming down the street and you see that person coming, that both of you don't cross, or one of you, you don't both make sure that one of you crosses. Those very rudimentary steps towards the reconstitution of a kind of common existence is where belonging it figures in this. And often it has a lot to do with the idea that, you have to let the survivors have to figure out a way to allow the killers to belong, which seems like a huge forgiveness.
Yeah, I feel like you and I were talking about this thing of reconciliation is not about the past, it's about the future. And it is a sort of like hope that is not a like Pollyanna wide-eyed hope, but it's like a hope that the future can be achievable. And
it's not very rosy. It's often quite pragmatic, right?
Yeah,
when you say, well, I've reconciled myself to it, you're not really saying like, all better now. You're kind of saying, I'm not in constant conflict with it, right? I found and that place shifts, but I found a place to put it to rest a little bit, or to live with it. To reconcile is to live with it.
Yeah, and I feel like one thing I noticed in all of your books is this thing of like, what is this is going to sound very abstract, and I promise if I have more time, I'll get more concrete. But this thing of like grief for like an alternate future that didn't happen, like I feel like Salamisha, your book has this interesting chronology where it's like you're in the present revisiting like you're like on the pilgrimage on the Stations of the Cross, but the stations are like the Nina Simone pilgrimage, and you at each stage there's like, oh, if only, she had been more supported in her town. If only she had been let in to the conservatory, you know, like there's this future that could have happened. And then Albert, I feel like you constantly have this sort of parallel universe of like your own family, like the people who remain in the Philippines actually end up in this counterintuitive way, like more prosperous than the people who come here. Like your uncle is a baggage handler, SFO, but in the Philippines, he's like a super famous pop star, you know, and he sacrifices it to come here. But the people who didn't come here, like they're doing great, you know. And Megan, your book ends on this sort of profound note of grief, which is like grief for your own past. Like if only you had never been sick, or if you had been able to be healthier in your 30s, you know. So I don't really know what I'm asking, but I feel like there is this element of like temporality and like possibility and like an alternate future that could have happened, but part of it is qualified in this way that like it's hard, you know. So there's this element of like grieving for the future that didn't happen in favor of like the dystopia that we have, you know. But it's still hopeful because there's the chance of like, you know, a process, like, you know, how insane the process sounds in Rwanda, you know, it sounds insane, but there is this like ongoing day-to-day thing where the people that you're meeting are like talking to each other and like figuring out how do they mark it out for themselves. And some of them are like, screw this, I'm just going to go to the city and like leave behind this street. And other people are like, I'm going to still, you know, face it out and like have a relationship with this person who did violence to me. I don't know. Is this question interesting to you guys?
Yeah, well, there's this sort of, I think the present day creates this sense of inevitability, right? Like I think about how when I was kind of born in America, there's a sense that, of course, we came to America instead of living in this developing world country. America is inevitable. America is the promised land that everyone wants to come to. But I think that sort of sense of inevitability of the present we've gotten to sort of lets off the hook the powerful people who sort of made the decisions that only seem inevitable in hindsight. Like it wasn't just that we came to America because it was the empire of the age. You have to trace it back and see the 300 years of disinvestment that Spain and then America had laid in the Philippines, you know, erasing out all the rice crops and trading them in for cash crops and tobacco crops that people could not eat off of and live off of. So I think in sort of thinking about these parallel universes or these alternate paths forward, it's important to sort of tie that to the sense of accountability for the actual tangible policy decisions made by people sitting in rooms determining the fates of others.
Yeah, I guess I think that's why I was interested in her as a prophetic figure, right? And so you're given all these different occasions, both on an individual level and then on a national or state level, to attempt to address the founding sin of the nation. So Nina Simone writes this song, Mississippi Goddamn, and you know, she kind of describes right there what will happen to America if it doesn't deal with racism, right? And she says, it'll, you know, everyone will die and die like flies. I mean, it's pretty as explicit as you're going to get about what happens to a country that refuses to recognize its citizens as full citizens and treat them constantly as second class. And so I think for me, both like there's like the what if, you know, her genius was recognized in her time? What if, you know, we listened to her after the bombing in Birmingham? What if? And I guess for me, it's this moment that, well, this is why she keeps on, both like the timelessness of her sound and her music and the virtuosity there, but also her insistence that the nation recognizes and reckons with itself. And so we're given all these opportunities. And so for me, that's where the kind of like the sadness, the deep sadness comes in, because we already just saw, we're living in another moment when we can really grapple with what does it mean to be a white supremacist nation as its founding. So yeah, I guess it's almost like, you know, sliding doors in some ways, but also I feel like though I'm moving in and out of time, I'm trying to really also remind us in the present that we still have the tools and we have the lessons from the past, and this voice reminding us that we can make different choices today. And if we make those different choices today, then our future will look quite different. So I don't know, I guess I'm like, the book has all this that plays with temporality. but I actually feel like maybe my commitments are to the present in order to imagine a future that she wasn't able to see, but that, well, she wasn't able to live, but she was able to see the possibilities in.
Megan or Philip?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sorry, I was just taking in all that Sally Misha just said, because it's so resonant beyond Nina Simone, as you're saying, to the nation. And I, as you said, Ken, there is, a lot of grief in my book, certainly at the end. In a funny way, I could only grieve at the end when I kind of get some answers about what was wrong in my case, what was really going on in my body. But I think the alternate future in the book is not just my own alternate future one, the one in which I could have known what it was to have a 30s or have children younger, not that I would ever trade my beautiful children, but I do have for younger, different versions of them. But I think one of the really profound and actually hard to talk about aspects of getting sick in the mysterious way that I did was that it really did create a change in me, which is this change in focus from the individual to the social, right? I think I had this, kind of type A, upper middle class, like focus on self-improvement and my own life story and trajectory, right? And when you get ill and everything is taken out of your control, for me, there was really nothing redemptive about that experience because there was no name for it, there was no recognition. But what there was the kind of hard confrontation with the reality that as sick as I was, it wasn't about me. This was much bigger than me. There were tens of millions of others in similar circumstances, and sometimes in much harder circumstances, because for different reasons, they lacked the access to healthcare that I had or the means to keep persevering. And so there was this kind of like profound shift in focus from my own recovery, right? When I first got sick, all I wanted was to get better, to how do we change, right? And the last section of my book is called Healing, and it's not because it's a recovery narrative. I'm really writing against the recovery narrative tradition of, kind of sickness and recovery, but because I did want to gesture to a hopefulness that it's, what we were just talking about, that in this moment, if we really did account for our history and we have the tools to offer a different kind of health care that really does have care in it, and different kinds of social policies and different kinds of accountability to one another that we've seen has been really hard in COVID to have, right? But that I remain really committed to that vision of a possible future in which we understand our bodies as porous to one another's bodies, and our immune systems are the ultimate symbol of that the actions of others have impact on my immune system, and my immune system has impacts on those around me. So I think it goes to that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think probably it's taken me a long time to write this book because I have not been as inclined as I might have been at other times to generalize or universalize from the individual experiences. I'm trying to really let them stand. They're not, even within Rwanda, even within their tiny communities, they're highly particular. Each person, and in some ways, if you think about people who were killed in 100 days, 1 million of them en masse by basically treating like an entire people as a person and trying to dismember it, then sort of just letting, watching, just seeing how particular they are and how even with almost identical experiences. I mean, we're talking about a space, the area of a city block on a slope in the middle of the countryside. That you can say, well, this is where things are going, or this is where things are going. One thing, though, that is very much about sort of the pushing towards the future side of it, or where it, people get on with it. One thinks, how could I get on with it if I went through that? But you get on with it, right? You don't get on with it at once. We're talking now 25 years since I first visited that hill, and that was already a couple of years after the genocide. Many of these people were in very rough shape, and one of the things that's interesting is to see what they do or don't talk about over time, right? Some people will be more forthcoming on certain visits, and it might seem that that's because they're doing better or they're doing worse. You know, some people speak more when they're doing worse, and they kind of shut it all down when they're going forward. But the economic aspect of life, just the sheer need to kind of prosper or build, or, you know, make your farm better or make your house better or look after your kids, or and the extent to which that also serves the causes of social reconstitution, that the more people who are doing a little bit better, and it, you know, we're talking about a little bit better, but that there's some healthcare, that some of the kids are going to better schools than they ever might have, that you see somebody like you getting an opportunity, and even if you or your own kids aren't getting it, you know that it's at least possible. That kind of stuff starts to also figure, so that the energy of looking after stuff is very important to people. But what the guy I read about, Calixte, says when he says, you know, this guy is there and he has his wife and they can make more children. That's something that I started to hear more and more of, especially from the younger generation, where there was this genuine feel. That was, in a way, the way that they expressed the absences of their families. It was almost like a kind of Darwinian understanding of what had happened in their society. Is those guys may be the stigmatized ones, and they may have had to go to jail, and they may be like looked down on some level, but they've got their whole families. You know, when they die natural deaths after coming out of prison, they die at home with daughters-in-law who are breeding, as one person said to me. I was like, whoa, that's a pretty stark way of putting it. But then I thought, right, of the survivors on this hill, almost all the ones that are still living there that I knew were women who had either never or not never married or not remarried, and one or two of them without remarrying and had like a kid or another kid. But as they said, you know, when you'd say, you know, did you ever want to marry anybody? They're like, do you see a lot of men around here? You know, they're not the two main killers on this hill had between them something like 19 children. And of those, something like 12 were living on the hill and had children. And the rest of them were households of one or two still, the survivors. So there you have a sense of the future that's very different. You can see why some people just leave for the city. They don't see a future there, but they're also very committed to it in some way. It's the one place that they can be close to the family that's not there.
Yeah, it's funny how children, or even emotional children, I feel like in a lot of your books, there's this sense that they're not children are our future, but like in a more like abstract way. Like Megan, your book ends really lovingly on, you know, the body can bring horrors, but it can also bring your child. And Salamisha, I feel like your kids are actually really important to your book, because it's sort of about like, how do we as a movement create an ethical world for other people, you know? I have like a billion more questions for you, but I'm getting messages saying that our time is running out. And so I thought I would just read really quickly some of the questions in the chat, like as a bank, and then you can answer them and then we can sign off. So Megan, there are two questions for you. One is from Aaron Robertson asking if you can talk about a relationship between chronic illness and the loss of faith that Americans have in the healthcare system, and a kind of privatization of health, like wellness, therapy, self-care. Another person asks about if you have thoughts on narrative medicine. Salamisha, you have a comment from Valora Howell, who says that your book sounds fascinating and I loved what I heard. Also, Aaron Robinson says, in thinking of African-American prophetic traditions, the prophets have so often been linked to patriarchal religious leaders going back hundreds of years. What attracted you to this framework when writing about Simone? I think this is like a Cornell West framework, maybe, is that right? I don't know. Philip from Mike. And also another question that just popped up. Salamisha, who do you see as contemporary torchbearers of Nina Simone's legacy? And I know the second half of your book is sort of about contemporary artists. Megan, how do you feel that American society can ensure the dignity of immunocompromised people as COVID becomes endemic? And then Philip, you have a long question. You write very movingly about the near constant crisis of people, enemies, victims, living alongside each other. But people want to be good people. I've seen and felt your writing affect people so intensely. What is the practical on the ground result of writing with compassion for someone, you know, if they're a killer or if they've experienced great pain? When you are there, is your writing available to the people you write about? How does this affect your position as a journalist? And you know, maybe Albert, that's a question that you're a very different story, but you're usually writing as a journalist, but here you're writing about things that are both very far, like colonial history, and also very near, like your mom, like who becomes a QAnon Trump, you know, person. Like, what does she think about your book? So I guess Megan or Salamisha, I don't know if you want to start since you had more time to digest in our quiz show.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the turn to wellness and private solutions has a whole host of very complicated reasons. But certainly the fact that so many people who live with these amorphous, hard to measure, hard to treat conditions are met often with kind of lack of recognition from conventional medicine does probably push a lot of them toward alternative treatments and wellness. I think too, though, you know, there's this genuine look for a kind of antidote for our hyperproductive, frenetic society too, that whatever we make of wellness culture and the kind of commodification of wellness, it's there as a proposed solution to something that is a problem, right? And certainly in the kinds of chronic illnesses that I'm talking about, which are more prevalent than ever, behavioral modifications have huge impact on the quality of life of patients. And it's not something that conventional medicine works really hard with patients on or is really set up to work with patients on. So yeah, I absolutely think a lot of people are looking for answers and turning to wellness. Narrative medicine is a really fascinating area of medicine. It's sort of how all medicine should work. Narratives should be just a given, I think. But I did want to speak to this question of immunocompromised people really quickly, which is to say, this is one of the things I'm wrestling with the most right now, David. It's something I'm thinking about very actively and constantly, which is how do we balance the needs of a diverse group of people in America? You know, there's the real need for some people to get back to their lives for mental health reasons, for other reasons. And there's the real need, as you say, to ensure the dignity and acknowledge the humanity of immunocompromised people. And I think the biggest objection I have to the discourse right now is that there's very little real engagement with the immunocompromised, right? There's sort of this way in which the media almost treats them as an afterthought. Everyone should be fine now, of course, except for the immunocompromised. You know, let's keep talking. And I think for immunocompromised people to have that dignity, again, we need to be having this social conversation in which real care is extended to really the extraordinary number of people who are on medicines or have conditions that leave them immunocompromised, right? So there's this kind of fake nod to we care about your well-being that I think immunocompromised people know is fake, or no nod at all. And it's really hard then to have a collective conversation about what does the future look like that feels like it's taking the humanity and reality of those people very seriously. Yeah.
Thank you, Megan. That's a really thoughtful answer, actually. And Aaron, thanks so much for all your questions. My mom is Valora Howell, who likes my books. I have to acknowledge that. I grew up with, I mentioned her early on, but I did grow up in that jazz household. But I guess the idea of the prophet. So yeah, I was thinking on one hand, how even in the Black prophetic tradition, it's a pretty patrilineal narrative or patrilineal tradition. And so on one hand, I'm trying to do like a couple of things. One, like locate Nina Simone within that, right? Alongside King, alongside Malcolm X, perhaps. And then also by invoking Cassandra as a kind of a woman that we never listened to, what's at stake in that. But then also I want to kind of expand her, get her beyond even those categories. What's fascinating to me about Nina Simone is that she's like, you know, when we think about her music, we often think of it as like timeless, right? And so and she's both timeless and timely. but that when you're thinking about the kind of sweep of history, which she kind of invokes in a song like Mississippi Goddam or another song like For Women, that she's at this kind of crossroads of time. And so this is what I think my book is trying to like model in terms of my collapsing of time, that she's both like backwards looking and forward thinking, right? That she's a prophet that can kind of, you know, like the best way of thinking of it is like the Oracle and the Matrix, I guess, right? That she's all seeing. And that I think is different than how we've also thought about the prophet as in a way is always looking forward, but not necessarily summoning this idea of the past. And this past has to do with like our question earlier about reconciliation or restitution or reckoning, right? Like you have to, as a Black woman who's a seer, she can't shed that's coming forward as she's anticipating what's to come. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do with the book, I think.
Mike, thanks for the question. It's my work is available to anybody who can read English or French or so in Rwanda. It's available there, and obviously with ebooks that makes it a little bit more available. Unfortunately, it's not available in Kinyarwanda, and if it were, there are not a lot of people who can only read Kinyarwanda who could afford even, you know, the cheapest book or reader, and who would read a book like that, you know. So, but I had a pretty interesting experience in that respect, which was towards the end of the reporting for the book I'm working on now. I was trying to sort of figure out the geography of the missing houses on the hill, you know, where people who had been killed and whose houses had been destroyed had lived, and just, which is this incredible proximity. And I was just walking one day across the top of the hill, and there was a woman and a guy sitting there on the grass chatting, and I asked a couple of questions, and I was asking the names of do you know where so and so might have lived? And she sort of said, yeah. And then I said, and then the guy said, is there a problem? And I said, no. And I explained through my interpreter who that I've been coming here for like 20 years, and a bunch of people around here probably can tell you that. And here's what I'm interested in. And I've just been trying to sort of understand how people are living with it afterwards now. And the woman stood up and said, yeah, he was my uncle, and he was a big killer here. You say you've written about this, you're writing about this place. Have you written any books or articles that are available in Kinyarwanda? Because it's extremely hard to explain to my kids that their grandparents were big killers by myself, and it would be really helpful to have something that put the history together so I could tell them. And I can tell you, I've heard that from survivors or from people who don't have accountability issues necessarily with this, but to hear it from her was a sign that a lot of time had passed, and that there was some kind of a generational change, especially because she was saying it in public, and people stopped to listen, and people stopped to talk, and she was extremely forthcoming, but that was like an incredibly interesting response to me, and an unexpected one, because in all these years, most people actually, strangely, never ask me what I'm doing. I mean, I explain to them what I'm doing, but then I'm just the guy who comes back from time to time and has ongoing encounters with them, and who I've never, I just have no idea what exactly they think I'm doing. With what I tell them, they know that it has no direct consequence for them. That's what they know. Like, it doesn't come back to them from outside, and nobody ever bothers them about it. It's not as if like I'm reporting to people who then come out of curiosity or anything like that. It's pretty, it's kind of like an ongoing, the fact that I know them and that I know other people on the Hill, or that matters a lot to people when you go back and back and back over the years. And I find that almost everybody talks better on the second visit, and they also talk more, even if they don't have anything new to say. If you come the fourth time, they tell you what's been going on in the meantime.
Albert, I don't know if you see, there's another question for you about growing up in the Fillmore, and if you're connected. I mean, you quote from a great memoir from Maya Angelou about growing up in the Fillmore. Are you connected? Aaron asks about kind of the history of faith traditions there.
Yeah, thanks for the question and support, Aaron. And I'll sort of blend my answer with the question you posed as well, Ken, about being a journalist writing memoir. It was sort of an opposite issue, right? I'm sort of very familiar with being an outsider, delving into other communities, and sort of using that self-awareness and self-consciousness to be very sensitive to make sure I'm representing them well, but also having to dig up all the puzzle pieces I don't have. Now I had all the puzzle pieces, I had all the access to the sources, and it was sort of a question of omission and a question of making sure that I applied the same sort of journalistic rigor to my own family that I would to somebody else's. And so in terms of the impact of the Fillmore on sort of our household, it wasn't so much in terms of the faith stuff. It was actually growing up in kind of a disinvested, predominantly Black community that before it was the Black community was the predominantly Japanese community that was sort of wiped out by internment camps. So when my great auntie first got there, which was around the time Maya Angelou lived there, it was newly a Black community as folks were kind of moving into the houses that had been emptied out by Japanese folks sent to internment camps. And when my grandmother came 3 decades later in 1978, she had a bit of a problem because she came on a tourist visa and she overstayed it. And she wasn't really sure how to play that, didn't really have a plan. One day, she and my great auntie are walking home from the bus stop and they get held up, they get mugged, their purses are stolen. Then the police arrive and they ask, what was stolen? And my grandmother says, oh, my green card was stolen in the purse, even though she didn't have a green card. And this was the days before these very sophisticated data operations. So a couple of weeks later, like magic, there was a green card that popped up in her mailing address. And there was this really rich irony in America pushing us into this neglected corner only for that very neglected criminality to validate us, administratively at least. If only the story were true. I was so hyped to hear that part of the narrative. It sort of tied things together perfectly. And when I asked my mom about it, she disputed it. And she said, no, actually, that wasn't the case. Grandma would never do that. She was really by the books. She never overstayed. She had the green card before. All this and that. I sent a public records request to immigration services, got her whole immigration file. It had some clues, but no answers. And so it was sort of this question of what am I to do with this information? And I sort of handled it the way any journalist would, right? Which is I say, according to these two sources, my auntie and this other auntie, this is the story my grandmother told. According to my mother, this was not the case. The records show that it may have been true, but nothing proves it either way. And sort of just embracing that sort of ambiguity, because it does sort of play into this idea that history is ambiguous in many ways. And those that tell history have a responsibility to tell it accurately, because so much of history has not been recorded, has been erased, and has been told, to suit the interests of those in power. So I actually think the ultimate impact of the Fillmore District, if you are to believe our family fable, was in legitimizing our state in America, and sort of seeing that entire neighborhood rise and gentrify as our little duplex has kind of stayed there over the years.
Yeah, if you haven't read Albert's book, I highly recommend it just for the shrewdness of his many relatives who have to think on the spot. I want to thank all four of you. I feel like you were so present and gave such thoughtful, profound answers. I don't know if it's possible for the audience to unmute to applaud or to, woo woo, go team. Something so
Use the
dispiriting about
reaction button at the bottom of their screen. We're over.
Oh, you're not allowed to.
You're not allowed to unmute. Yeah, we mute folks because
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if any of you would like to do the thumbs up, happy face,
thumbs up, claps,
shooting out fireworks, whatever emoji reaction. I hope all four of these books are great. Salamishah and Phillips are works in progress, but you should definitely check out their past works if you haven't already. Megan Albert's books are just out right now. Also, if you are a creative writer, check out the Whiting Foundation website to learn about the grant. And again, the two books that are just out, Concepcion by Albert and Invisible Kingdom coming out next month by Megan. Thank you so much for all of you for attending on Zoom. I wish we were in person. Thank you, Whiting Foundation. Thank you, Brooklyn Public Library.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you all to all of our authors. Thank you, audience. And even though we might not have everything in the library collection yet, because we're waiting on Megan's new book, all of our authors today, including our brilliant moderator, have their books in the Brooklyn Public Library collection. So please check them out from the library. And thank you so much for being here
Thank you.
tonight.
Here.
To the library.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thanks, Ken. Those
Thank
were
you.
beautiful questions and thoughts. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So thoughtful, Ken. So nice to be here with you all.
Bye.